In this video, we're going to take a look at the Jinhao 51A. Let's jump straight to the end with my thoughts on this pen. I find this to be a perfectly comfortable pen to use, though it is a bit thinner in my hand than I would prefer. It's very light, and with that, the two of them together, for me, it's far from the perfect pen. But as a very affordable pen to start out in fountain pens, I think this is absolutely great. I do think it's very interesting because you can get it in a couple of varieties. One where it's aerometric, so that if you wanted to experiment with that, you could, and one with a standard international. Now, this I don't know about being a great pen to give someone starting out in fountain pens, and the reason for it is the hooded nib works fantastic as a hooded nib, but generally when people start out with something like a fountain pen, they want to see that exposed nib, which can be a downfall looking at this pen if you're thinking about being able to give it to someone. Regardless of that, it does provide a very nice writing experience. It has a lot of feedback, not scratchy at all, but for someone more used to ballpoints and pencils, it certainly mimics what that can feel like writing. It doesn't give the full fountain pen experience, in my opinion. It gives a lot more feedback than I would prefer. Now that we know how I feel about the Jinhao 51A, let's see how I got to that opinion, starting with the unboxing. The Jinhao 51A comes with no box and just bubble wrapped in a mailer. Being so inexpensive, the lack of packaging wasn't any kind of an issue, and I don't see it really being an issue for this pen in the future. It can be kind of nice when you have an inexpensive pen to not have a bunch of packaging you have to get rid of. It's not like I worry about how to store this pen to keep it as safe as possible. With the pen out of the box, we need to get to the nib, and as long as it doesn't take 20 turns to uncap, I'm generally okay. So how many turns does it take to uncap? The Jinhao 51A is a pull cap. The hooded nib that we see is absolutely perfect in how it does work. When capped, it does keep it very wet, or if you have it out uncapped, more specifically, while note-taking, it keeps that nib wet much longer than a bunch of exposed nibs. So I do see this as a very good pen for students to use. I don't think my students would enjoy it because it doesn't have the exposed nib. This gets us to the nib. This pen has a steel fine nib. The hooded nib is, as I said, has a lot of feedback, more than I would prefer, but it's not a problem. For a student note taker, this becomes a real advantage with this pen, because if you don't always cap your pen between taking some notes, you can go quite a bit longer than if this pen had an exposed nib, which does make this great for student note takers. If you enjoy videos like this, then be sure to hit the subscribe button. Now, let's ink this pen up. The Jinhao 51A uses standard international cartridges or converters and holds approximately 0.7 milliliters of ink. The ink for today is Pilot 100th Anniversary Red. I'm not generally a fan of standard international converters, but with this being very inexpensive, and that is something that has to come up quite frequently, this being standard international is an advantage for it. It doesn't make it an issue if you have any kind of problem with yours. They're very cheap to replace, and you can get them in bulk. As a habit, I don't normally post my pens, but some people like to post pens, and some pens need to be posted to use comfortably. This pen does post nice, deep, very secure. It doesn't move at all. It feels good in the hand. Doesn't stick out so far so that it's comical, not at all. If you wanted to use it unposted, you could. You see just how deep that posting really is. It comes a significant way down the barrel. Very nice design. Now, the important part, the writing sample. The strangest thing for me while I write with it is, since it is very light and thinner than I would prefer, I would expect some hand cramping. But I don't experience that with it. I think while it's thinner than I prefer, it's thick enough that I don't have any kind of a problem with it. I do wish there was a little bit more weight towards the front of the pen, because I find while writing with this, I actually have to not push hard, but I have to put a little bit more pressure to write with this pen than I do with some of my others. But the price point makes it hard to really have something to complain about on this pen. Any pen that you can get super cheap, or a bunch of them super cheap, it's hard to really have any major complaint about, and I don't have any for this. This is a pen that I have frequently brought to work and used for many days, and I don't have any fear about leaving it in my classroom. In fact, I tend to have 3 or 4 of them in my classroom sitting in my cabinet for different colors, like reds when I need a red. So it's really good with that. And the drier nib on cheap paper in a classroom definitely works out with this pen. So that student note taker, this is a great pen. That teacher that needs a pen that they can hand to a student, this is a great pen. Is this a pen that you have to have in your collection because you're going to be missing out? No, but its writing experience is perfectly adequate, and if I was willing to spend about 30 seconds or a minute, I could take some of that excessive feedback that this pen has. And the last time on that excessive feedback, it's not scratchy, just a lot more feedback than I like. Now for something a bit more standard in comparing writing size. I use Mnemosyne Blue to do this, and here's how it compares to a Jowo Extra Fine on the left, medium in the middle, and a 1.1 stub on the right. We can see that as it writes, it is a narrow fine. It's between kind of a fine and extra fine. And since I see a lot of people using this more towards cheaper papers, I think that's a very good thing with this nib and the fact that it's a bit drier to write with. But how does this pen compare to other nibs I've used? Looking at the writing of a Jinhao 51A with a fine nib, here it is next to a TWSBI Vac Mini with a fine nib, a TWSBI Mini with a fine nib, a Kaweco 475 with a Vintage Flex fine nib, a Hero 7035 with a fine nib, and a Waterman Graduate also with a fine nib. So it isn't a review without some size comparisons. Here it is capped. Here it is uncapped. And here it is posted. We see in the size comparisons, it is a smaller pen, but that's in comparison to fountain pens. If you compare it to pens that most people are used to, then it is probably thought of as a little bit larger. So for that, it's small as a fountain pen, not small when it's in your pocket next to a ballpoint. At this point, we have a dirty pen, so let's go clean it up. Be sure to check out the next pen review when we take a look at the Visconti Van Gogh. If you want to be able to support not just my channel, but any reviewer, then when you make a purchase, be sure to tell that retailer where you heard about it. Thanks for watching.